To be honest, my experience there was kind of difficult and maybe not all positive. So I guess by sharing my struggles, maybe some of you can be a little bit better prepared than I was at the time before you start your degree there. In this video, I want to specifically cover 5 areas that I think are really important to pay attention to and to think about. So I'm going to cover money, I'm going to cover workload, class, a cultural shock, and my personal struggles. But before we get into these areas, I want to share a little bit of background information about myself. Hi, I'm Katja. I now work as a photographer in Berlin, and I actually finished my A-level equivalent, like German A-level equivalent here in Germany, which is called the Abitur. And while I was completing my A-levels, I already applied to Oxford. At the time, I applied as an EU student. I'm pretty sure the regulations have changed because of Brexit now. But at the time, I could apply as an EU student, and my degree was from 2008 to 2012. I applied to do a law degree at Oxford, and I actually applied to do law and German law, which is a degree where you spend 3 years at Oxford and 1 year abroad in Germany. I had to go through different stages in the application, as you may know. In the end, I was accepted at Catz College, which is one of the newer colleges that has been built in the 60s. And if I remember correctly, it's actually one of the biggest undergraduate colleges at Oxford. So at the time, I was super ecstatic when I was accepted. I actually cried when I opened my acceptance letter, and it was a big surprise to me. I had never expected to get in, but I was super, super happy, and it was kind of a dream of mine come true. So then I had to finish my Abitur, my A-levels in Germany, and I was super excited to actually move abroad. And in the beginning, when starting my degree and arriving at Oxford, everything was just super exciting and new, but it was also overwhelming. And I did feel a little bit lonely, especially arriving there from abroad and everybody kind of already being part of a similar culture, I believe. And I felt immediately a little bit on the outside just because I didn't do A-levels. I didn't grow up in English culture. So I did feel a little bit lonely and as an outsider. But over the next 2 years, I would say everything would change for me. And I would say the change was not sudden. It was more gradual. So I kind of didn't even notice it, or maybe I just didn't really want to accept it because it was such a big dream of mine to get in. I didn't want to accept the fact that I had gotten in and that I was at this like elite world university, and that something was not feeling right for me, that I was not feeling happy over time. I was actually even feeling more and more depressed and more lonely as time went by. And I couldn't pinpoint at the time why this was happening and what were the reasons that I was starting to struggle at Oxford. So now looking back at it, after I have went through the entire experience, I think I can identify 5 areas that were crucial in adding kind of to my heaviness and adding to my struggles there. So let's talk about the first one first. And I think this is actually something that I did notice pretty much from the beginning, but it was a little bit subtle, and I grew more and more aware of this over time. And this is just simply culture shock. So as I mentioned, I moved to Oxford from Berlin, Germany, and the change was not only in terms of, as a German, kind of entering into a predominantly English culture. And I would say that the majority of the undergraduate law students are from somewhere in the UK. So there was this kind of UK versus Germany culture clash. But there was also the topic of me moving from like a big capital city with like over, I think 3.5 or like 4 million people living in Berlin to a city of like 250,000, like a small student town. So specifically in terms of like my own culture and Germanness, I guess I found it very hard at the beginning to understand people just because the way I learned English with more of an American accent, and the British accent was a little bit foreign to me. And it was not only the different accents from people in the UK that were hard to understand for me, but also just the type of words and vocabulary people were using on a daily basis was so unfamiliar to me and a little bit difficult to understand that in the beginning I found it hard to follow some of the conversations that people were having around me. Another aspect to this was that I didn't have a common frame of reference with a lot of people just because of the culture that I grew up in, but I never expected German culture and English culture to be so different, but let me tell you, they are. I'd say Germans are much more direct and English people are a little bit more reserved and a little bit more indirect in their whole communication style. But also the TV shows we would consume or the childhood books that we would have read would be very different. So when people make jokes about it and use this frame of reference of their culture, as an outsider to that culture, it's just like you don't know what people are referring. So you cannot laugh about the same jokes because you don't understand the jokes, and vice versa. So when you make jokes, people maybe find you a little bit awkward, or they found me a little bit awkward because I couldn't pinpoint the same humor that English people would have. And also in terms of culture, at Oxford, the going out and drinking culture was very different to what I was used to in Berlin. I'd say in Berlin, people start a little bit early and they have kind of their wild years when they're 16, 17, 18. And then everything becomes a little bit more routine and normal, and you have your friend group and maybe you go out for a beer or wine, you sit in a bar, and of course you also go clubbing, but everything kind of starts later in Berlin. So people don't go out, say, before 1 a.m. and then they go out all night. Whereas in Oxford, people would start drinking heavily very early and then go out to the club very early, get even more drunk, and then be probably out by 2 a.m. or something to 3 a.m. at the latest. And so all these little bits and pieces of culture were just not what I was used to, and a little bit of a shock to me and a shock to my system, and made me feel like I didn't immediately fit in with everybody else. And while we're on the subject of not fitting in, I want to move on to kind of area number 2 that I want to talk about, and it's a little bit controversial, I would say, but very much prevalent in Oxford, and this is classism. So I guess this is no surprise to anybody, and something that people have been discussing and talking about and also criticizing openly before. For me, I kind of underestimated this aspect for actually starting my degree there. And it's the fact that a lot of people who go to Oxford come from families that have gone to Oxford or Cambridge over generations. They come from money and they come from, this heritage and history and kind of class that they belong to. So a lot of people have gone to very elite and posh high schools or public schools, as you would say in the UK, and have played some of some of the elite sports like lacrosse and polo, all of these things, and have already been surrounded by people of their kind of same social standing and social bubble. And I'd say you would feel this in college life, that people kind of came from a similar class would to kind of find each other quickly and stick together because they have common friends, they have common relatives, maybe even they have come from a similar background, and you do feel like you're not fitting in with these people, and it's very hard to connect to people who come from the same social bubble and you come from an entirely different experience and background. And what I found really interesting as well as a German, or what dawned on me much later on into my experience, was that people could pretty much place you in terms of your social class the minute you open your mouth, because people can kind of hear by your accent whether you come from the same sort of background as they do or maybe from a completely different background. So the difficulty is that if you come from such different experiences and backgrounds, you don't have an overlap. And again, that frame of reference thing. You cannot talk about the same sports. You cannot talk about the same, like maybe social events that you've attended or your experience and how hard it was to go to public school and like how hard your gap year was, or I don't know, like all of these things that people have in common, you just don't have in common with them. So you cannot participate in a lot of the conversations that people are having about these topics, especially in the first couple of weeks as a fresher and like people getting to know each other. I felt left out a lot of the time. And tying into this whole thing, I want to talk, of course, about like one of the most important topics, I guess, and it's money. Or maybe it's only important to people who don't have a lot of it. Maybe it's less important if money is not an issue for you. But for me, money was one of the biggest issues from the moment I started. And actually, I was pretty lucky because when I started my degree in 2008, the cost of a degree at Oxford was still like just a third of pretty much what it is now. So at the time, I think it was around £3,500 per year that I would take out as a student loan from the student loans company. By now, I think they have tripled that amount. So money will be even more of an issue. But even like setting aside the cost of the degree itself in terms of student loans, because most people do get it as a loan and have to pay it back after they finish. I think an even bigger factor is the cost of living at Oxford, which is just insane. So in my experience and actually looking it up as well, Oxford is like one of the most expensive cities to live in the entire UK. And I can attest to that. So you're paying for accommodation, you're paying for books. And in terms of my law degree, we had to buy a lot of books because they would come out with new editions every year. So you couldn't just like get them out of the library, or there was not enough copies for everybody to get the books from the library. So you would need to buy like, I'd say at least 50% of all the books you need for your degree, you would need to buy them. So cost of living, books, then food. Of course, food in college is subsidized, but still if you're like eating out from time to time, and as a student, you don't have a lot of time to cook. So you need like kind of quick meals, like ready meals that you would get at the supermarket or you eat in college. Also, you eat in college to be social and participate in social events. This would add up. And my parents could support me to a certain point, but I was on a much lower budget than a lot of my peers. And I would feel it. I would feel like I couldn't participate in a lot of social events just because I didn't have the money to spend on it. And I was on a tighter budget. So I couldn't go like drinks out, and I couldn't go to meals out, and I couldn't go to like these big events like the summer balls where tickets cost like £200 or £300 per ticket. Then you would also need a dress, and you would need dresses for like fancy dress parties, like dressing up. You would have like all these parties to go to and dress up for them, and you would need to buy stuff for it. One of the big cost factors is joining the Oxford Union, which is like this big debate club where a lot of people join in the beginning, but the price to join was around like £300 at the time. And for me, this was just money that I didn't have. So I couldn't join, and I couldn't go to the events, and I couldn't participate in a lot of. And what adds to this whole thing is officially, as an Oxford student, you are not allowed to work while you study. So I guess the solution for a lot of students in other places who are struggling with money is just to get a job alongside your degree. Well, this is not allowed at Oxford. You can do like some small jobs, like work maybe in the library or in the student hall, which I did, but it's a very limited capacity in which you are allowed to have a job and to work alongside your degree. And it does add like a lot of pressure and stress because you already such short term times and time to study. You only have like 8-week terms. So it's next to impossible to really like have a job and study at the same time. So I guess my advice would be just kind of know this and anticipate this. If you think you will have money struggles, maybe there's some way before you start uni you can prepare for it, and it will definitely take like a little bit of pressure off if you can kind of budget for that time beforehand. All right, let's talk about the next area, and this is the topic of workload. I guess this comes at no surprise, but the workload at Oxford is really, really heavy. And for me, it was not really a surprise, but it was something that was hard to get used to, and also a big change from how I experienced working for school. So our reading lists were designed in a way that you could not possibly physically finish them. Most weeks there would be so many articles, books, cases to read that you could maybe finish. If you would work like really consistently and really hard, you could maybe finish like 80% of them, and the rest you would have to like either skip or maybe read on your free kind of vacation time or like in between term time. But to be honest, by the end of each term, I would feel so burnt out that I just couldn't bring myself then go back and finish all the readings that I hadn't finished during term. I needed to rest and I needed like a vacation. And I guess this is not the way you're supposed to work there. You're supposed to work beyond these terms, but I found them personally so stressful. Each week we had like 1 or 2 like assigned essays of about 2,500 words, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, that we would need to hand in and that we would need to finish the reading for. And I guess in retrospect, I just have to kind of be honest with myself and say that maybe I'm just not the type of person who enjoys that form of like academic reading and writing. Or maybe I do enjoy it to a point, but not at the like level of intensity that is expected of you when you attend Oxford. And let's be real, like doing a lot of reading is just also like a very sort of lonely pursuit. So a lot of my days would be spent kind of locked up in my room or in the library or just somewhere studying. And I do get that it may be enjoyable for a lot of people. It was just not enjoyable for me, with the added pressure of like time and handing in an essay and doing this over and over and over again every week. So I've covered culture shock, money struggles, the insane workload, and the classism that I experienced. And all of these definitely added kind of to my unhappiness and added to my mental health, just sort of deteriorating from like week 1, I'd say like well into my second year, when I then finally went and like got myself some help. Were also some personal struggles that I was experiencing at the time that had nothing to do, I'd say, with like Oxford itself, but which contributed to me like feeling more and more depressed, to be honest. And this was like some family stuff going on. It was also a long distance relationship from the beginning, which I'm thankful that I went through it and it all worked out with the relationship. But at the time, it was super hard to juggle like a relationship, long distance, and studying there in a new country by myself and trying to new friends and trying to understand the culture and trying to budget and trying to be good at my degree. I guess me not coming from a family that knows and shares the experience that I had to go through, it was just overall like a lot of responsibility on my shoulders. I had to do all the paperwork for student loans and this and that myself. My parents don't actually speak English, so I guess it was just all of these stresses of like kind of having to grow up overnight and becoming an adult overnight by myself in a foreign country, while at home there's like stressful stuff going on with like my parents and family. And I guess all of that just kind of accumulated in the end and made me feel depressed. Yeah, maybe adding on to this is also the fact that I realized that maybe not only like the academia aspect, it's not for me, but also the law degree itself. Because when I finished law school, when I finished Oxford, I didn't pursue a legal career because I realized throughout the degree that law and a legal career, whether in academia or outside of academia, was not something that I wanted to spend my time doing. So I guess it was also the fact that my law degree just did not fit me. But maybe I need to make another video about like how I then went on from studying law to now working as a photographer. Let me know if you want to see that video and I'm going to make it for you. Is there a silver lining? Is there a silver lining to my experience, to my, I'd say, predominantly bad experience that I had? And yes, there is a silver. I guess the biggest one is that going through the experience made me stronger as a human. It made me more resilient. It made me aware of how I need to deal with mental health issues. And it also just massively improved my language skills. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able probably to make this kind of video for you now. And it also made me be able to share about my experience. So by me making this video, I'm really hoping to help some people who are considering going there and who might experience some of the pitfalls that I experience, and who could possibly, now that you are aware of them, now that I've shared them with you, you can prepare yourself. You can maybe get some resources that could help you to not experience this type of loneliness, this type of culture shock, and maybe even reconsider whether it's worth it to apply for you, whether you are the type of person that is academic and that can deal with all of these challenges that for myself were maybe too much. So I'm hoping this video was helpful to you, and if it was, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel.